Major Ava Sinclair, a decorated Army officer, moved into her dream home in the prestigious Highland Grove neighborhood. She thought she was finally leaving the battlefield behind. But one ordinary morning changed everything. Ava found herself staring down the barrel of injustice not overseas, but on her own front porch. A simple act of cleaning her steps turned into a confrontation with three officers who saw her as an intruder rather than a homeowner. What began as a tense encounter soon unraveled a sinister web of greed, fear, and corruption, revealing that Highland Grove wasn't just a quiet suburb. It was the center of a dangerous scheme designed to force innocent people out of their homes. But the men behind it underestimated Ava. She wasn't just a soldier, she was a fighter. Armed with her unbreakable resolve and an unwavering sense of justice, Ava pushed back against the powers, trying to silence her. Yet as she dug deeper, she learned that this wasn't just about her. It was about a community, a system, and a choice that could change everything. Would she stand alone? Or would the truth rally those too afraid to speak? The sun rose over Highland Grove in warm hues of gold and crimson, casting its glow on a neighborhood of luxury. Glistening stone pathways wound between pristine white fences, and the hum of sprinklers brought a quiet rhythm to the otherwise still morning. The houses, each a testament to architectural splendor, stood like fortresses of success. In front of her new villa, Major Ava Sinclair scrubbed the front steps with a mop. Her gray t-shirt clung to her frame as the morning heat intensified, but she didn't mind the work. After years overseas in unpredictable terrains and hostile environments, something as ordinary as cleaning her own doorstep felt almost therapeutic. This house represented the life she had earned her sanctuary after decades of service to her country. But peace, Ava would soon learn, is a fragile thing. The hum of tires rolling over pavement drew her attention. A police cruiser slowly approached, its flashing lights off, but the tension it carried was palpable. Ava paused, watching as the vehicle came to a stop in front of her driveway. Three officers stepped out, their movements synchronized like wolves circling prey. The leader, Officer Brooks, was tall and broad-shouldered, with a square jaw that set in a permanent scowl. His uniform, though pristine, carried the air of someone who'd long since forgotten the meaning of service. Behind him, Officers Trent and Carter fanned out silent but watchful. Ava's hand tightened around the mop handle as Brooks approached. "Morning," Ava greeted, her voice calm but firm. Brooks's gaze scanned her from head to toe, lingering with a slow, assessing judgment. He ignored her greeting. "What are you doing here?" Ava blinked, taken aback. "I live here," she replied, wiping sweat from her brow. Brooks folded his arms, his stance widening in a show of authority. "This is your house?" His tone carried the unmistakable weight of doubt. "Yes." Trent, a wiry man with a smirk that hinted at something darker, let out a low chuckle. "Looks a little expensive." Ava's stomach clenched, but she forced herself to remain composed. "It is. But I assure you it's mine." Carter, the youngest of the three, glanced nervously between Ava and Brooks, as if unsure of how far things would go. Brooks stepped closer, closing the distance between them. "We got a call about suspicious activity. Thought maybe someone was trespassing." Ava's eyes narrowed. "Suspicious because I'm cleaning my porch?" Brooks's smile was humorless. "You'd be surprised what people report these days." "I'd be more surprised," Ava shot back, "if you weren't using that as an excuse." The air between them grew heavier, like a storm about to break. Ava's years in the military had honed her ability to read body language, and Brooks's posture screamed intimidation, but she was no stranger to intimidation tactics. "Proof of ownership," Brooks demanded. Ava crossed her arms, refusing to budge. "You don't have the right to ask me that." Brooks's face darkened. "You're refusing to cooperate?" Ava's heart beat faster, but not with fear, with anger. "I'm refusing to let you violate my rights." Trent muttered something under his breath, a half laugh. Brooks's hand drifted toward his belt. Not his gun, not yet, but close enough to send a message. Ava's instincts sharpened like a blade. "Look," Brooks said, his voice deceptively soft. "Let us take a quick look around inside, and we'll be on our way." "No," Ava replied, her tone steely. "Unless you have a warrant, you're not stepping foot past this porch." For a moment, the standoff froze in time. A bird fluttered from a nearby tree, the only thing brave enough to move. Then Brooks's patience snapped. "Watch yourself," he warned, stepping closer, now inches from Ava. His breath reeked of coffee and arrogance. "You're about to make this harder than it needs to be." Ava met his gaze head-on, unflinching. "The only one making this hard is you." Brooks's jaw twitched, and for a moment Ava thought he might lunge. But instead, he nodded to Trent and Carter. "Go inside," Brooks ordered. Ava's voice cracked through the air like a whip. "Don't you dare!" But it was too late. Trent and Carter brushed past her and disappeared into the house. Ava turned to follow, but Brooks blocked her path with an outstretched arm. "You want to add resisting to the list?" Brooks taunted. Ava's fists clenched at her sides. She was trapped, unable to stop the invasion without escalating things further. Her mind raced, considering her options. Somewhere inside, her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. The security system was recording everything. But would that be enough? Across the street, hidden behind a hedge, someone watched the scene unfold. Mark Callahan crouched low, his phone held steady as he recorded the entire interaction. His pulse pounded in his ears. To anyone else, Mark was just a nosy neighbor with a camera. But to Ava, if she knew who he really was, Mark was much more. Years ago, Ava's unit had led a mission that exposed corruption in an Allied command overseas. Mark, once a respected soldier, had been among those disgraced in the aftermath. She didn't know his face, only his name, but Mark had never forgotten hers. Now, as he filmed Ava standing alone against the three officers, something twisted in his gut. This wasn't the scene of a criminal at work. It was a woman defending her home. The same honor she'd once wielded against him was now aimed at these men. The irony wasn't lost on him. Neither was the importance of what he captured. Inside the villa, Trent and Carter moved through the rooms like hunters, opening doors and cabinets with unnecessary force. They weren't looking for evidence, they were looking for excuses. But as they reached the study, they stopped in their tracks. Photos lined the walls, Ava in full military uniform, standing with city officials, including the police chief. Trent's mouth went dry. "We just stepped in it." Carter's eyes widened. "She's not just military, she's connected." The weight of their mistake settled over them like a lead weight. Carter pulled Trent's sleeve. "We've got to stop Brooks." Without another word, they turned and sprinted back toward the door. Outside, Brooks was still standing toe-to-toe with Ava, his hand dangerously close to his holster. "Brooks!" Carter shouted as he burst out the door, panic evident in his voice. "Stop!" Brooks turned, confused. "What?" "She's Major Ava Sinclair," Carter gasped. "She knows the chief." Brooks's face went pale as the reality hit him. But when he turned back to Ava, he found her expression unchanged, cold, unwavering. The battle was only just beginning. The silence that followed Carter's panicked shout was deafening. Ava stood still, her heart pounding as the pieces clicked together in Brooks's mind. His eyes darted from Ava's calm, unwavering face to the house where his men had just returned from their fruitless search. Slowly, he lowered his hand from his holster, but the glint in his eyes didn't soften. "Major Sinclair, huh?" Brooks's voice was strained, as though the weight of his mistake was crushing him. "Well, that doesn't mean you're above the law." Ava didn't move. "Neither are you." Carter, still breathless, tried to interject. "Brooks, we need to go now." Brooks ignored him, his pride refusing to back down. He glanced over his shoulder at Trent, who shifted uncomfortably, sweat trickling down his temple. For all their bravado earlier, the two younger officers looked as though the ground had been pulled from beneath their feet. "This isn't over," Brooks growled, stepping back. "We'll be in touch." Ava folded her arms. "I'm sure you will." The three officers returned to their cruiser, their departure slow and reluctant. Ava waited until the taillights disappeared down the road before exhaling the breath she'd been holding. The weight of the encounter settled on her shoulders, heavier than her gear ever had been in the field. She turned toward the open front door, her eyes scanning for any sign of damage. Nothing appeared out of place, but she knew better than to trust appearances. She was about to step inside when a voice called out, "Major Sinclair." Ava turned sharply, her instincts flaring until she saw the figure emerge from the hedge across the street. It was Mark Callahan, dressed in a plain hoodie and jeans, holding his phone in one hand. She didn't recognize him, but his presence immediately put her on edge. "You're a long way from just being a concerned neighbor," Ava noted, eyes narrowing. Mark raised his hands in a placating gesture. "I recorded everything," he said, holding out his phone. "They can't spin this, it's all here." Ava hesitated, her mind working through possible motives. "Why?" Mark's lips pressed into a thin line. "Let's just say I've seen this happen before, and no one believed the victim." He paused, as though debating whether to say more. "The footage is yours if you want it." Ava studied him. His face was familiar in a distant, nagging way, but she couldn't quite place him. She walked down the steps, taking the phone with a measured nod. The screen displayed the video clearly. Brooks's aggressive stance, Trent and Carter storming in without cause the moment Brooks reached for his weapon. It was damning. Mark's eyes met hers. "You'll need it." "I already have security footage," Ava replied, tucking his phone into her pocket for safekeeping. "But thanks." Mark nodded but didn't move to leave. "This won't stop with them, you know? Brooks isn't just some bad apple, he's part of something bigger." Ava's pulse quickened. "What do you know?" Mark shifted his weight, glancing around as though he feared being overheard. "It's not safe out here. May I come in?" Ava's instincts screamed at her not to trust him, but the information he dangled in front of her was too tempting to ignore. She led him inside, closing the door firmly behind them. Mark took in the clean, modern interior, with a brief glance before turning back to Ava. "I need you to be straight with me," Ava began, crossing her arms again. "Who are you?" Mark hesitated before answering. "Mark Callahan, formerly Sergeant Callahan." He watched for Ava's reaction, and when her eyes narrowed further, he gave a rueful smile. "You probably don't remember me, but I remember you. We crossed paths overseas, different units. Same operation." The fog in Ava's memory began to clear as the name clicked. Callahan had been part of an Allied task force, disgraced after an internal scandal that implicated several soldiers in illegal dealings. Ava had been one of the few who'd refused to cover it up. She took a step closer. "You were discharged," Mark nodded. "Dishonorably." Ava's jaw tightened. "And now you're here. Why?" Mark's expression darkened. "Because people like Brooks remind me of the officers who threw me to the wolves. They're part of a system that rewards loyalty to the wrong things." "That still doesn't explain how you knew to record today." Mark hesitated. "I was already watching Brooks. The guy's been leaning on homeowners here for months, using scare tactics to push people out." He pulled a USB drive from his pocket and placed it on the counter. "I've been collecting footage from other encounters. Yours just happened to be the one where he crossed the line in broad daylight." Ava stared at the small silver drive, a swirl of emotions building inside her. Meanwhile, at the precinct, Brooks paced the hallway outside the chief's office, his nerves unraveling with every step. Trent and Carter sat on a nearby bench, their postures rigid with dread. The door to Chief Gordon's office opened, and the older man stepped out. His graying hair and furrowed brow made him look older than his 50 years, but his eyes still held an iron sharpness. Brooks, he called, gesturing him inside. Brooks straightened and walked in, the door closing behind him. Gordon leaned against his desk, arms crossed. "What's this I hear about unauthorized entry and drawing your weapon?" Brooks's jaw clenched. She resisted. "That's not what the report says," Gordon interrupted. He sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Do you have any idea what kind of storm you've started? She's not just some random civilian. She's Major Ava Sinclair." Brooks faltered. "I didn't know." "Well, now you do." Gordon's voice was cold. "Do you have any idea who she knows? You think she's going to let this slide?" "I can fix this," Brooks insisted. Gordon's eyes hardened. "No, you can't. And if this comes out, I'm not covering for you. You're on your own." Back at Ava's villa, Mark's voice broke the silence. "You need to know something." Ava turned back to him. "This isn't just about you," Mark said. "If they've come after you, it means you're standing in the way of something bigger." Ava's eyes darkened with resolve. "Then I'll make sure they know exactly who they're up against." Mark gave a small nod. "Good. Because once you start this fight, there's no turning back." The sunlight filtered through the large windows of Ava's study, illuminating the medals and framed certificates that lined the walls, each a symbol of hard-fought victories and sacrifices. But today, the room was filled with an uneasy tension as Ava and Mark stared at the USB drive he had placed on the counter. Ava's thoughts churned as she processed everything he'd said. It was true Brooks's behavior felt too calculated, too brazen for a simple patrol officer stepping out of line. There was more to this. "You said Brooks has been pushing people out of the neighborhood," Ava began, her voice calm but measured. "Why?" Mark crossed his arms, his gaze darkening. "To make room for buyers connected to a real estate developer. The guy's buying up properties cheap after the residents get scared off. Then he sells them for 3 times the value. And guess who's protecting the racket?" Ava's stomach twisted as the truth settled in. She'd expected some level of corruption, but this was a coordinated effort, a strategy disguised as enforcement. "Let me guess," Ava said coldly. "Brooks and his buddies get a cut for their service." Mark nodded. "And it's not just them. There's someone higher up pulling the strings." He hesitated before continuing. "I don't have proof yet, but I think Gordon's involved." Ava's jaw tightened. Chief Gordon had built a reputation as a no-nonsense leader, but she knew firsthand how public reputations could be a facade. She wasn't willing to make assumptions without evidence, though. She picked up the USB and walked to her laptop, inserting the drive. A series of video files loaded, each labeled by date and location. Ava clicked on the most recent one. The screen flickered to life, showing a shaky but clear video of Brooks standing in a parking lot at dusk, talking to a man in a sleek gray suit. The audio wasn't perfect, but some words were distinguishable. A final push. House on Maple. Another incident should scare them off. Ava leaned in, her heart pounding. The suited man handed Brooks an envelope, thick with cash, before nodding and walking away. Brooks tucked the envelope into his jacket and glanced over his shoulder. Mark watched Ava's face as the video ended. "That man is Lucas Kent. He owns the real estate firm that's been snatching up these properties. Every time there's a police report of suspicious behavior or a resident file a complaint, somehow they end up moving out within a month." Ava sat back, her mind connecting the dots. The encounter at her house wasn't random. She wasn't just a resident in their way. She was a threat to their entire operation. "So this isn't just about pushing out families," Ava murmured. "It's about controlling the entire neighborhood." Mark nodded grimly. "And you standing your ground today probably threw a wrench in their plans." Ava stared at the dark screen. She had fought in war zones, exposed corruption in military command, and held the line against insurgents. But this was happening in her backyard, with badges and bureaucrats instead of uniforms and rifles. "They wanted me to break," Ava said quietly, almost to herself. Mark's voice was steady. But you didn't. Ava looked up, her gaze burning with resolve. No, I didn't. And now, they're going to regret it. At the police precinct, Brooks sat in a dimly lit office, his fists clenched on the desk as he stared at the floor. He could feel his career slipping through his fingers. Trent and Carter sat silently across from him, exchanging uneasy glances. The tension in the room was suffocating. We shouldn't have gone in, Carter muttered, finally breaking the silence. She's not just some random person. She's a decorated major. Brooks's glare was sharp enough to cut steel. I don't care who she is, he spat. She's standing in the way. Trent shifted nervously. Look, maybe it's time we pull back. This is getting too risky. Brooks shot up from his chair, pacing like a caged animal. You think Kent is going to let us walk away? We're in this whether we like it or not. He turned to face them, his voice low but furious. If we back down now, we're done. Do you understand? Carter swallowed hard, but Trent looked away, guilt settling heavily on his face. The door opened suddenly, and Lucas Kent himself stepped inside, his polished shoes clicking on the tiled floor. His sharp features and tailored suit made him look more like a politician than a businessman. But his eyes told a different story, calculating and cold. You're losing control, Kent said smoothly, closing the door behind him. I warned you not to get sloppy. Brooks's face reddened. She's tougher than we expected. And now, she has connections. Kent's expression didn't change. Connections or not, she's a problem, and problems need to be dealt with before they grow. Brooks hesitated. You mean, permanently? Kent's smile was thin. I didn't say that. He walked over to Brooks, placing a hand on his shoulder. But you need to find a way to neutralize her, legally or otherwise. Brooks's jaw tightened. He knew what Kent meant, eliminate her credibility. Make her the villain. I'll handle it, Brooks muttered. You'd better. Kent's voice was soft but deadly. Because if you don't, I will. Back at Ava's house, she shut her laptop and stood, her determination solidified. I need to speak to Gordon, she said. Mark frowned. You sure that's a good idea? If he's involved? I need to know, Ava interrupted. If he's dirty, I'll deal with it. But if he's not, I need him to take this seriously. Mark hesitated, then nodded. Just be careful. Ava grabbed her jacket and keys. Before leaving, she turned back to him. Stay here. Watch the house. And if you see anything, call me. Mark gave her a grim smile. Got it. As Ava stepped outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the driveway. She wasn't naive. This wasn't a simple confrontation anymore. This was war. And she was prepared to fight. With each step toward her car, one thought echoed in her mind. They wanted a fight. Now they're going to get one. The police precinct loomed ahead like a fortress of bureaucracy. Ava parked in front, her mind sharp with anticipation. She replayed her conversation with Mark and the damning footage of Brooks accepting a bribe. If Chief Gordon was involved, she needed to know for sure. Ava's boots clacked against the tiled floor as she entered the precinct, turning heads as she walked past officers who recognized her uniform and rank. The receptionist stammered as she greeted Ava. Major Sinclair, Chief Gordon is expecting you. Second floor, room 203. Ava nodded but didn't stop to chat. She stepped into the elevator, the hum of the rising floors matching her heartbeat. When the doors opened, she was greeted by a grim-faced Chief Gordon standing in the hallway. Major, Gordon greeted, extending a hand. His eyes were guarded, his demeanor formal. Come in. The office was neat. Almost sterile awards and commendations lined the walls, but they felt hollow today. Ava stepped inside, remaining standing. Take a seat, Gordon offered, but Ava shook her head. I'll stand, she replied, her tone unreadable. Gordon sighed and closed the door. I heard about the incident. Incident? Ava's voice was sharp. "One of your officers drew a gun on me and broke into my home." She folded her arms. "That's not an incident. That's a crime." Gordon leaned against his desk, his jaw tightening. "I won't defend what they did. Brooks has always been difficult." Ava didn't flinch. "It's more than that. He's working with Lucas Kent." She pulled out the USB and placed it on the desk. "That drive has footage of your officer accepting bribes. He's been scaring people out of their homes for months." Gordon's face darkened as he stared at the USB. "And I'm not convinced he's doing it alone," Ava continued. Her eyes locked on Gordon. "Are you going to tell me you didn't know?" For a moment, the office was silent. Gordon's face hardened into something unreadable. Then he let out a slow breath. "I've had my suspicions," he admitted, "but no proof. If I'd acted without it, it would have been my career on the line." "So you let it slide?" Ava's voice was cold. "I tried to tighten the reins," Gordon said defensively. "But Brooks is part of something bigger. He's protected." "By Kent?" Ava pressed. Gordon hesitated, then nodded. "Kent has influence connections in City Hall, the department, even the mayor's office. It's hard to touch him without blowing everything up." Ava felt the weight of his words, but it only fueled her anger. "You could have fought back." "And lost," Gordon muttered bitterly. Ava shook her head. "You didn't just lose. You let them win." Gordon's shoulders slumped under the burden of years of compromise. He reached for the USB drive. "What's your plan?" "I want them off the streets," Ava replied. "Brooks, Trent, Carter, every officer complicit in this. I need you to do your job, or I'll go public." Gordon nodded slowly. "If what's on here is as bad as you say, I'll open an investigation. But it has to be airtight, or Kent will bury us both." Ava's eyes didn't waver. "Then don't give him the chance." Meanwhile, across town in an upscale restaurant's private room, Brooks sat in silence while Lucas Kent swirled a glass of red wine. The two men had met here before it was their usual spot to discuss business. But tonight's conversation wasn't going to be friendly. "You told me you had it handled," Kent began, his voice calm but dangerous. Brooks's jaw clenched. "She blindsided me. I didn't know she was a major." Kent placed his glass down carefully. "Do you think that matters to me? You were supposed to intimidate her, make her back off. Instead, you've created a storm." Brooks shifted in his chair, feeling the walls closing in. "She's making moves, but I can still contain it." Kent leaned forward, his sharp eyes narrowing. "No, you can't." Brooks's breath caught. "What do you mean?" Kent's smile was icy. "She's already ahead of you. And once the public gets wind of this, you're expendable." Brooks's stomach twisted. "You're cutting me loose?" "Not yet," Kent replied smoothly. "But if you fail again, I'll make sure you take the fall alone." Brooks's mind reeled. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The promises Kent had made, the promotions, the payouts they felt distant now, replaced by the cold realization that Kent would throw him under the bus the moment it became convenient. "I need to know if Gordon's loyal," Kent continued, his voice like a razor's edge. "If he's wavering, we need to deal with him too." Brooks nodded, forcing himself to look composed. But inside, panic clawed at him. Back at the precinct, Gordon called an emergency meeting with his senior staff. Ava watched from the hallway as the department's leadership filed into the conference room. Gordon stood at the head of the table, holding the USB in his hand. "This ends now," he declared. "Effective immediately, Officers Brooks, Trent, and Carter are suspended pending an internal investigation." Murmurs of shock rippled through the room. Some officers exchanged wary glances, while others nodded in grim approval. "We will work with external oversight," Gordon continued, his tone resolute, "and we will make this process transparent." One senior officer cleared his throat. "Chief, with respect, are you sure this is the right move? Kent has influence if he pushes back." I'm not afraid of Kent, Gordon interrupted. His eyes burned with the weight of years of silence finally breaking. I'm afraid of what happens if we don't clean this up. Ava watched through the glass window, a flicker of respect warming her resolve. Maybe Gordon wasn't entirely complicit, just beaten down by years of compromise, but she wasn't ready to let her guard down yet. As she turned to leave, her phone buzzed. Mark's voice came through the line, tense and urgent. Ava, you need to get back to your house, now. Ava's pulse quickened. What happened? There's a car parked outside, Mark said. I don't think they're here to drop off cookies. Ava's blood ran cold, but her voice was steady. Stay inside. Lock the doors. I'm on my way. She hung up and sprinted for the exit, her mind racing. The fight wasn't over. It was just getting started. As she sped down the streets toward her home, one thought echoed in her mind. If they're making this move, they're desperate, and desperate people make mistakes. Ava's car screeched to a halt outside her house, the tires leaving faint marks on the pavement. She barely registered the evening sun sinking behind the trees as she scanned her property. The street was unnervingly quiet. Her eyes locked onto the black sedan parked across the street windows, tinted too dark to see inside. It was positioned strategically, with a perfect view of her villa. Ava's instincts screamed surveillance. She grabbed her phone and called Mark. Mark, I'm here. Do you see anyone? Mark's voice came through, tight and controlled. No movement yet, but I've got the front covered. Whoever's inside hasn't made a move. Ava took a breath, her training kicking in. Stay put. I'll check the perimeter. Slipping her house keys between her fingers like makeshift brass knuckles, she moved swiftly toward the back of her property. She was no stranger to ambushes, but this wasn't some distant war zone. This was her home. The backyard was quiet, save for the rustle of leaves in the wind. Ava's footsteps were silent on the grass. She reached the back fence and crouched low, scanning for any signs of intruders. Nothing seemed out of place until she noticed something glinting in the dim light near the side window. She crept closer and found a thin metallic strip resting against the window frame. A listening device. Her teeth clenched as fury bubbled inside her. She tapped the earpiece and spoke softly. Mark? They bugged the place. Mark's voice sharpened. Do you want me to call the police? Ava hesitated. Calling the local precinct was risky. They couldn't know which officers were still loyal to Kent. She needed someone who wasn't compromised. Not yet, Ava replied. We don't know who to trust. I'm coming in. She moved around the side and unlocked the back door with a quiet click, slipping inside. Mark was already in the living room, crouched near the window with a baseball bat in his hands. His face was pale, but determined. They've been here, Ava said, pointing to the bug. We're being watched. Mark's eyes darkened. They're getting desperate. Ava nodded, her mind racing, which means we have a chance to turn this around. Meanwhile, across town, Brooks sat at a dimly lit bar, nursing a whiskey. His nerves were raw, his mind spinning from the meeting with Kent and Gordon's decision to suspend him. He'd thought he had control. Now it felt like the world was slipping through his fingers. The seat beside him shifted as Trent slid onto the bar stool. He looked around cautiously before speaking. Brooks, we're in over our heads. Trent's voice was low, almost a whisper. Brooks's eyes flickered with frustration. We knew the risks. Yeah, but I didn't sign up to go to prison. Trent leaned closer, his voice urgent. Carter's already talking about cutting a deal. If he turns on us, we're done. Brooks's grip tightened around his glass. He'd spent years building his position, playing the game. But now, the walls were closing in, and Carter was a weak link. Back at Ava's house, she and Mark stood in front of the laptop in her study, their faces illuminated by the blue glow of the screen. The security footage from earlier that day played out in front of them, Brooks storming up the steps, his hand near his holster. Ava clicked through to the most recent timestamp from the evening. The camera outside captured the black sedan pulling up just before sunset. Two men in dark suits exited, carrying a briefcase. They didn't approach the house, just lingered by the sedan, scanning the area before getting back inside. Ava paused the video. "Recognize them?" Mark squinted. "The taller one. I've seen him before. He works security for Kent's firm." Ava's mind raced. Why send security to watch me unless Kent thinks I'm about to blow his operation wide open? She reached for her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the name she needed. Rachel Cole, a journalist known for exposing corruption. If anyone could help shine a light on this, it was her. Ava hit call. Rachel's voice answered on the second ring. "Ava, I didn't expect to hear from you." "I need your help," Ava said, her voice steady. "And you're the only one I trust to get the truth out." There was a pause before Rachel spoke again. "Tell me everything." The next morning, the city woke to a headline that sent shockwaves through Highland Grove. Corruption in Highland Grove. Police officers caught colluding with real estate mogul Lucas Kent. Rachel's article included the footage. Ava had provided the video of Brooks taking the bribe, the black sedan surveilling Ava's home, and witness accounts of homeowners being harassed into selling their properties. The news spread like wildfire. By noon, City Hall was flooded with calls from outraged residents demanding answers. Mayor Walsh was forced to issue a public statement promising a full investigation. Inside the precinct, chaos erupted as officers read the article on their phones. Some murmured in disbelief, while others exchanged grim looks. Brooks burst through the front doors, his face a mask of rage. He stormed into the hallway and slammed his fist into a locker, the metallic clang echoing through the building. Carter watched from the break room, pale and trembling. His phone buzzed a text from Ava. "Meet me at the Overlook Cafe. We need to talk." Carter stared at the screen, sweat forming on his brow. He knew if he ignored her, things would only get worse. But if he went, he'd be choosing sides. At the Overlook Cafe, Ava sat at a corner table, sipping her coffee. She didn't look up when Carter entered, but she could feel his hesitation. He slid into the seat across from her, glancing nervously at the door. "Relax," Ava said. "No one followed you." Carter fidgeted with the edge of a napkin. "What do you want?" Ava leaned forward, her gaze sharp. "The truth. You're not like Brooks. You didn't sign up for this." Carter's shoulders slumped. "I didn't, but I'm in too deep." "You can get out," Ava said firmly. "But only if you help me." Carter hesitated, then nodded slowly. "What do you need?" Ava's voice was calm but determined. "Everything you know about Kent. Every file. Every name." Carter swallowed hard, but the guilt in his eyes was enough to seal his decision. "Okay." Ava's grip on her coffee cup tightened. She was building her case piece by piece, and now, with Carter's help, the truth was finally within reach. But as they left the cafe, Ava noticed a familiar car parked across the street. The same black sedan. "They're watching us," Ava muttered. Carter froze. "What do we do?" Ava's eyes darkened. "We show them we're not afraid." The black sedan idled across the street like a predator watching its prey. Ava's eyes locked on the car, her mind calculating. She leaned in close to Carter as they exited the cafe, her voice low but firm. "Walk to your car. Don't look back. Act normal." Carter's face paled, but he nodded. "And you?" Ava's lips curved into a grim smile. "I'll give them something to chase." Carter hesitated, then turned and walked briskly down the sidewalk toward his car. Ava waited until he was halfway down the block before making her move. She stepped off the curb and crossed the street, heading directly toward the sedan. The driver tensed as she approached, her steady gaze daring him to stay put. The moment she reached the car, the engine revved to life, and the vehicle sped off, tires squealing. Ava didn't flinch as the wind whipped her hair. She memorized the license plate before the car disappeared around the corner. She took a deep breath and glanced down the street. Carter had made it to his car and was pulling away safely. She whispered to herself, "One more crack in your armor, Kent." 10 minutes later, Ava returned home, her mind buzzing with possibilities. Mark was sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open, a mug of coffee in hand. He looked up as she entered. "Everything okay?" he asked, concern etched across his face. Ava nodded and slid into the chair across from him. "They were watching us at the cafe." Mark's brow furrowed. "They're getting bolder." "They're desperate," Ava corrected, "and that means they're going to make mistakes." Mark tapped a few keys on his laptop and turned the screen toward Ava. "Speaking of mistakes, I ran the plates on that sedan. It's registered to a shell company linked to Lucas Kent's real estate firm." Ava smirked. "Exactly what I expected." She leaned back, folding her arms. "He's not even trying to hide anymore." Mark's face grew serious. "Which means he thinks he's untouchable, or he's setting you up." Ava's eyes darkened. "Let him try." Meanwhile, back at Kent's office, the mood was anything but calm. Kent leaned against his desk, his expression icy as he stared at Brooks and Trent. "You let her see you?" Kent's voice was soft, but the menace in it was unmistakable. Brooks shifted uncomfortably. "We didn't expect her to be that bold." Kent's jaw tightened as he stepped closer. "Sinclair isn't playing games. She's making moves." He picked up a file from his desk and tossed it onto the table. "The press is circling. City Hall's under fire, and now Carter's gone quiet." "Do you know what that means?" Trent swallowed hard. "He's flipping." Kent's eyes narrowed. "Exactly. And if Carter gives her the evidence she needs, we're done." Brooks's mind raced. "What do you want us to do?" Kent stared at them for a long moment. Then, in a low, cold voice, he said, "We need to discredit her. Make her look unstable, dangerous, someone the public can't trust." That night, Ava sat at her desk reviewing the files Carter had sent her earlier, a series of financial records that showed payments to officers like Brooks and Trent, funneled through shell companies. It was the smoking gun she needed. Mark peered over her shoulder. "This is enough to burn Kent to the ground." Ava nodded but remained cautious. "It will, but we need to be smart. If we release this the wrong way, Kent will twist it." Mark raised an eyebrow. "How?" Ava's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. It was Rachel Cole, the journalist she'd contacted. Ava answered, putting the call on speaker. "Ava," Rachel's voice was tense, "I just got word from a source Kent's team is spreading rumors about you. They're saying you're an unstable ex-soldier with a grudge." Ava exhaled slowly, her anger simmering beneath the surface. "Of course they are." "They're also saying you attacked Brooks," Rachel continued. "They're trying to paint him as the victim." Mark let out a low curse. "They're flipping the narrative." Ava clenched her fists. "Then we need to stay ahead of it." Rachel's voice softened. "I've scheduled an exclusive interview for tomorrow night. It's your chance to get the truth out there before they can control the story." Ava nodded. "I'll be there." The next day felt like the calm before the storm. Ava spent the morning preparing for the interview, rehearsing the key points she needed to hit. Expose the bribery scheme, reveal the harassment tactics Kent used, and highlight the involvement of officers like Brooks. By late afternoon, her phone rang again this time. It was Carter. "Ava." His voice was urgent. "Something's wrong." Her stomach twisted. "What is it?" "They know I talked to you," Carter said. His words rushed. "Brooks showed up at my house. He threatened my family." Ava's grip on the phone tightened. "Is your family safe?" Carter's voice cracked. "I sent them to my sister's place, but I'm scared, Ava. I don't know what to do." Ava's voice softened. "Listen to me, you did the right thing. Stay somewhere safe. I'll make sure they don't get away with this." Carter hesitated, then whispered, "I hope you're right." The line went dead, and Ava closed her eyes, breathing deeply to keep her fury in check. Mark watched her carefully. He's scared. Ava nodded. He should be. Mark leaned forward. What's the plan? Ava's eyes flashed with determination. We're not just going to expose them, we're going to make sure they can't cover this up. That evening, as the sun set over the city, Ava arrived at the television studio for her interview with Rachel Cole. The lights in the studio were bright, the cameras set to roll. Rachel greeted her with a firm handshake. Are you ready? Ava nodded. More than ever. Rachel led her to the stage, where Ava took a seat under the spotlight. As the countdown began, Ava's heartbeat slowed, her focus sharpening. The camera light blinked red. Rachel began, her voice steady. Tonight, we bring you a story of courage, corruption, and the pursuit of justice. Our guest is Major Ava Sinclair, who has taken a stand against a powerful force. Ava sat up straight, her voice calm and resolute. This isn't just about me, it's about every person who has ever been forced to give up their home because of fear and intimidation. And it's about accountability. Rachel leaned in. And do you believe you'll get that accountability? Ava's eyes burned with conviction. Yes. Because people deserve to know the truth, and they deserve leaders who don't cower in the face of corruption. The studio was silent, but Ava could feel the shift the moment when truth began to drown out the lies. But outside, in the shadows, Kent's men were already preparing their next move. The interview aired live across the city, and by the time Ava left the television studio, her phone was vibrating non-stop with messages, some from supportive viewers, others from people who had been victims of harassment just like her. The truth was spreading, and Kent's carefully constructed empire was starting to crack. Mark was waiting for her in the parking lot, leaning against her car. His face was tense, his arms crossed. That was powerful, he said, as she approached. But you've painted a target on your back. Ava unlocked the car and slid into the driver's seat. Good, she said. Let them come. The more desperate they get, the more mistakes they'll make. Mark climbed into the passenger seat, shutting the door behind him. I just hope you're ready for what's coming next. Ava started the engine. I've been ready since the day they pointed a gun at me. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit conference room at Kent's downtown office, the atmosphere was suffocating with tension. Kent paced in front of a long table where Brooks, Trent, and a few of his private security guards sat silently. The glow of a paused television screen behind them showed Ava's interview, her face frozen mid-sentence. She just dismantled our cover story, Kent said through clenched teeth. Every word she spoke chipped away at our narrative. Brooks stared at the table, his hands clenched into fists. We can still spin this. Kent stopped pacing and fixed Brooks with an icy glare. No, we can't. She's got the public on her side now. He leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. This is no longer about damage control, it's survival. Trent shifted nervously in his seat. What do you want us to do? Kent's smile was thin and sharp. We neutralize her. Brooks's eyes flickered with hesitation. You mean? Kent nodded slowly. Legally or otherwise, we make her disappear. At Ava's house, the living room lights cast a warm glow, but the air was anything but calm. Ava and Mark sat at the kitchen table, reviewing messages and tips from whistleblowers who had seen the interview. Carter was there too, sitting stiffly with a cup of coffee in his hands. His eyes darted to the windows every few seconds, his fear palpable. You're safe here, Ava assured him. They won't make a move while we're expecting it. Carter nodded weakly. I hope you're right. Mark scrolled through the messages on his laptop, his brow furrowed. We've got half a dozen more stories of intimidation tactics, forced sales, threats. Some of these people lost everything. Ava's jaw tightened. We're getting closer to the tipping point. Once we link all of this to Kent, he won't be able to talk his way out. Suddenly, Ava's phone buzzed. It was Rachel. Ava answered quickly. Rachel? Rachel's voice was hurried and laced with urgency. Ava, you need to get out of there. My source says Kent's team has put a tail on you, and it's not just surveillance. They're planning something. Ava's stomach dropped, but her voice remained calm. How soon? Soon, Rachel replied. You're not safe there. Ava's mind raced. She ended the call and looked up at Mark and Carter. We need to move now. Mark grabbed his bag without question. Where to? The safest place I know, Ava said. 30 minutes later, they pulled up to a quiet house on the outskirts of the city. The building was nondescript, surrounded by thick trees and an iron gate. Ava pressed a code into the keypad, and the gate creaked open. Mark raised an eyebrow as they drove inside. What is this place? Ava parked the car and stepped out. An old safe house I set up years ago. Military-grade security, hidden from public records. Carter climbed out, glancing around nervously. Is it really safe? Ava gave a faint smile. If they find us here, we've got bigger problems. Once inside, Ava checked the security feeds and reinforced the locks. Mark set up his laptop on the dining room table, while Carter paced restlessly. This is temporary, Ava said. We stay low, we regroup, and we make our next move. Carter stopped pacing and looked at her. And if they come after us? Ava's eyes hardened. Then we fight. At Kent's office, a phone rang sharply, cutting through the silence. Kent picked it up, his face darkening as he listened. They're gone, the voice on the other end reported. Kent slammed the phone down, his temper finally breaking. Find them. I don't care what it takes, find them. Brooks stood slowly, his face unreadable. And when we do? Kent's eyes gleamed with cold fury. Make sure she never gets another chance to speak. Back at the safe house, Ava's phone buzzed again. It was Rachel with more updates. They're searching for you, Rachel said. But I've got another lead. Someone inside Kent's operation wants to talk. Ava's brow furrowed. Is it legit? Rachel's voice was cautious but hopeful. I think so. They've seen the walls closing in. They're scared. Ava exchanged a glance with Mark, who nodded in silent agreement. Set up a meeting, Ava said. Somewhere neutral. Rachel hesitated. You're walking into dangerous territory. Ava's voice was steady. I've been walking in dangerous territory my whole life. Mark smiled faintly. And they're about to find out why that's a bad idea. The meeting was set for the following night, in an abandoned park pavilion, away from prying eyes. Ava knew the risk, but if this insider had information, it could be the final piece they needed to take Kent down. As she prepared, she thought about the people who had already paid the price families forced from their homes, Carter who risked his life to speak out, and the countless others who didn't have the strength or means to fight back. She clenched her fists. This ends now. And in the shadows, Kent's forces were already in motion, ready to strike. But Ava wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for justice. And she wasn't about to lose. The abandoned park pavilion was eerily quiet as the moon cast pale beams over the cracked pavement. The rustling of leaves in the cool night breeze was the only sound. Ava adjusted her jacket as she approached the meeting spot, every muscle in her body tense. Mark was a few feet behind her, scanning the shadows. His hand brushed the concealed holster at his side, a precaution neither of them wanted to use, but one they couldn't afford to be without. Carter had stayed behind at the safe house, his fear too great. Ava didn't blame him. He'd already risked enough. As Ava reached the pavilion, she spotted the figure waiting in the shadows. A woman stepped forward, her face partially obscured by a hood. Her eyes darted nervously around the park. Ava immediately recognized her. The woman had been at several of Kent's public events, always standing in the background, observing. You're from Kent's inner circle, Ava said quietly. The woman nodded. My name is Dana Reeves. I manage his records. Her voice trembled slightly. But I didn't sign up for this. Ava studied her carefully. Dana was young, barely in her 30s, but her haunted expression made her seem older. "What changed?" Ava asked, her voice even. Dana swallowed hard. "I didn't know how deep it went, how far he was willing to go. When I found out about the payoffs, the intimidation, I thought it would stop there. But now he's talking about eliminating people." Mark stepped closer, his voice low. "You mean Ava?" Dana nodded grimly. "You and anyone else who stands in his way." Ava's expression darkened. "Why are you coming forward now?" Dana hesitated, then pulled a small flash drive from her jacket pocket. "Because I have the proof you need. Financial records, memos, everything. It's all here." Ava reached for the drive but paused. "What's the catch?" Dana's eyes filled with desperation. "I need protection. If Kent finds out I've betrayed him, I won't survive." Ava took the flash drive and placed a reassuring hand on Dana's shoulder. "You did the right thing. We'll protect you." A sudden crack of a twig echoed through the park, shattering the moment. Ava's head whipped toward the sound. Mark stepped forward, eyes scanning the shadows. "We're not alone." Ava's instincts flared. "Move!" she ordered. The sound of footsteps erupted from the darkness as two figures emerged, dressed in black and armed with batons. Ava grabbed Dana and pulled her to the side as Mark drew his concealed weapon. The first man lunged at Ava, but she twisted, using his momentum against him. He stumbled forward, and Ava landed a hard elbow to his side before sweeping his legs out from under him. Mark raised his gun, aiming steadily. "Don't move!" The second assailant hesitated, but didn't lower his baton. Ava's voice rang out, clear and authoritative. "Think about this. Kent sent you to clean up his mess, but when this goes south, you'll be the ones taking the fall." The man's grip faltered. He looked at his fallen partner, then back at Ava. Slowly, he lowered the baton and took a step back. "Smart choice," Ava said, breathing heavily. Mark kicked the weapon away and motioned for the two men to leave. They ran into the darkness, their shadows disappearing among the trees. Dana was shaking, her back pressed against a pillar. Ava crouched beside her. "It's okay. You're safe." Dana looked up, tears welling in her eyes. "No one's safe from him." Back at the safe house, Ava plugged the flash drive into her laptop. Mark and Carter crowded around as files began to load. Each document was a nail in Kent's coffin: contracts tied to illegal property seizures, secret bank accounts, communications with Brooks outlining their intimidation strategies. Carter's eyes widened as he read one of the memos aloud. They paid officers bonuses for every homeowner forced to sell. He trailed off, shaking his head. "This is worse than I thought." Ava's jaw tightened. "This is everything we need." She sent copies of the files to Rachel Cole with a short message. "Release it all." Mark leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. "Once this hits the news, Kent won't have anywhere to hide." Ava nodded. "But he won't go down quietly." The next morning, the headlines blazed across every major outlet. "Real estate scandal exposed," "Evidence links Lucas Kent to corruption and police collusion." Rachel Cole's article went viral within minutes, detailing every damning piece of evidence Ava had provided. Screenshots of internal memos, bank records, and photos of secret meetings between Kent and city officials spread like wildfire. The city was in an uproar. Protests erupted outside Kent's office, and reporters swarmed the precinct, demanding statements from Chief Gordon. Gordon stood at the podium during a hastily arranged press conference, his expression grave. "The officers involved have been suspended, and formal charges are being filed against Lucas Kent and those complicit in his crimes." He took a deep breath. "We have a responsibility to restore the community's trust, and that starts now." In the crowd, Ava stood with her arms crossed, watching as the press hurled questions at Gordon. Rachel approached her, microphone in hand. "Ava, Rachel began. "The city owes you a debt of gratitude. But where do we go from here?" Ava's eyes were steely. "We rebuild. And we make sure this never happens again." The crowd erupted in applause as Ava's words echoed through the plaza. But even as Kent's empire crumbled, he wasn't done. At his private estate on the outskirts of the city, Kent paced his study like a caged animal. His phone rang, and he snatched it up. "You said this was contained," he spat. The voice on the other end was hesitant. "There's nothing more we can do. The evidence is everywhere." Kent's face twisted in fury. "Then we change the game." He hung up and slammed the phone down, his eyes blazing with desperation. His grip on power was slipping, but a man like Kent wouldn't go down without one last fight. That night, Ava returned to the safe house, exhausted but unrelenting. She knew Kent wasn't the type to surrender. As she locked the door behind her, she whispered to herself, "This isn't over." And deep down, she knew the final battle was coming. The city buzzed with the fallout from Rachel Cole's explosive article. Every news channel replayed clips from Ava's interview, alongside images of Kent leaving his office with reporters swarming like vultures. His expression was grim but composed as he pushed through the crowd. "Mr. Kent, do you deny the allegations? Did you authorize the intimidation tactics? Will you step down?" Kent said nothing. His silence only deepened the storm around him. But behind the calm exterior, Kent's mind was racing. His empire was crumbling, and time was running out. As he entered his armored SUV, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "It's time," he said coldly. "Activate the contingency plan." At the safe house, Ava sat at the dining table, flipping through the latest reports on her laptop. Protesters had gathered outside City Hall, demanding justice. The mayor had called for an emergency session, and public pressure was mounting by the hour. Mark leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "You did it. The whole city's finally waking up." Ava's fingers paused over the keyboard. "It's not over until Kent is behind bars." Carter, seated at the far end of the table, nodded nervously. "What's next?" Before Ava could respond, her phone buzzed. It was Chief Gordon. "Ava," his voice was tense. "Kent's been arrested, but his legal team is already pushing back. They're throwing everything at the wall to buy time." Ava's jaw tightened. "What about Brooks, Trent, and the others?" "They're all in custody," Gordon said. "But I need you to be prepared. Kent's not going to play fair. He's got a team of high-powered attorneys and other resources." Ava knew what that meant. "He'll try to make this about me," she muttered. "Discredit me, twist the narrative." "Yes," Gordon agreed. "The trial is set for tomorrow. You're the key witness, Ava. If they can break you on the stand, they might walk." Ava's grip tightened on the phone. "Then I won't break." The next morning, the courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the gallery, their cameras flashing as the doors opened, and Ava walked in, flanked by her legal counsel. She wore her formal military uniform, a calculated choice, a reminder to the jury and everyone watching of her service, her honor. Across the aisle, Kent sat with his legal team, impeccably dressed in a dark suit. His expression was calm, but his eyes gleamed with cold intent. Beside him, Brooks sat stiffly, his face pale. Trent and Carter were nowhere to be seen. They had already agreed to cooperate with the prosecution in exchange for leniency. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. "All rise." Ava took her seat at the witness stand as the prosecution began their questioning. The lead attorney, Ellen Parker, was sharp and precise. She walked to the center of the courtroom and addressed Ava. "Major Sinclair, can you describe the events that led to this investigation?" Ava's voice was steady as she recounted everything: the confrontation with Brooks and his officers, the illegal entry into her home, the threats, and the evidence she'd uncovered with Mark and Rachel's help. She detailed how Kent's company had weaponized fear and authority to steal homes and destroy lives. The jury hung on every word. When Parker finished, the defense attorney, a slick, polished man named Victor Haynes, stood. He adjusted his tie and walked toward Ava with an air of confidence. "Major Sinclair," he began, his tone almost friendly, "you've had a distinguished military career. You're trained to handle high-pressure situations, correct?" "Yes," Ava replied. Haynes nodded. "And would you say that training makes you confrontational?" Ava's eyes narrowed slightly. "It makes me prepared." Haynes smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Prepared? Interesting. So when Officer Brooks asked for proof of ownership, you chose not to provide it. Why?" Ava's voice remained calm. "Because he didn't have the legal right to ask. And I refuse to allow anyone to violate my rights, regardless of their badge." Haynes raised an eyebrow. "And when he attempted to secure the scene, did you escalate the situation by refusing to comply?" A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Ava sat up straighter. "I asserted my rights. The escalation came when he drew his weapon." Haynes's expression flickered. "A weapon he claims he only drew because he felt threatened." Ava locked eyes with Haynes. "By an unarmed woman in her own yard?" The jury shifted in their seats. Haynes knew he was losing control. He reached for one last tactic. "Major Sinclair, you fought in combat zones, haven't you? Experienced loss, trauma. Would you say that trauma affects how you interpret threats?" Ava's eyes didn't waver. "If I were unstable, I wouldn't have been entrusted with the lives of soldiers under my command. I wouldn't be here today." Haynes opened his mouth, but Ava leaned forward slightly and continued. "Let's be clear," Ava said, her voice resonating through the room. "This isn't about my service or my resilience. This is about greed and power, about Lucas Kent using fear to profit from vulnerable people." Haynes hesitated, then stepped back, defeated. No further questions. The prosecution rested, and the judge called for closing arguments. Ellen Parker's final statement was as sharp as a blade. "This case is about more than property and corruption. It's about trust. Trust in the institutions meant to protect us. Lucas Kent and his accomplices betrayed that trust, using authority as a weapon against innocent citizens. The evidence is undeniable. The testimony is clear. The law must hold them accountable." The defense's closing was hollow by comparison. The jury deliberated for hours, and every second felt like an eternity. Ava, Mark, and Carter sat together in the waiting room, the tension thick. Finally, the door opened. "The jury has reached a verdict." The courtroom filled once more as the judge returned to the bench. The foreperson stood, a sheet of paper trembling in her hands. "In the case of the People versus Lucas Kent, we find the defendant guilty on all counts." The room erupted. Reporters scrambled to capture the reaction as Kent slumped in his seat, his composure finally shattered. Brooks covered his face with his hands, knowing his fate was sealed. Ava closed her eyes briefly, exhaling a slow breath. Justice had been served, but the scars of the fight remained. That night, as Ava returned to her villa for the first time since the ordeal began, she stood on the porch and looked out at the quiet street. The neighborhood felt different, freer, lighter. But Ava knew the battle for justice didn't end here. Mark walked up beside her. "It's over," Ava smiled faintly. "For now?" He nodded. "So, what's next?" Ava's eyes shone with quiet determination. "We rebuild, stronger than before." She glanced at the stars overhead and whispered to herself, "No more fear." And with that, she stepped inside, ready to start again. The city was still buzzing from the verdict. News outlets ran continuous coverage of Kent's conviction, while social media lit up with messages of support for Ava Sinclair and condemnation for those who had betrayed their oaths. But for Ava, the fight wasn't over. It had only evolved. The next morning, Ava stood at her dining room table, papers and notebooks spread out in front of her. The house was still, the kind of quiet that felt unfamiliar after the storm she'd weathered. She had reclaimed her home, her peace, but a lingering restlessness gnawed at her. Mark appeared in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You've been up since dawn," he said, setting a cup in front of her. "Thinking about your next move?" Ava took a sip of the coffee, savoring its warmth before replying, "Yeah, the system didn't break overnight, and it won't heal overnight either." She looked down at a list of names people in the neighborhood who had come forward during the investigation. These people, they trusted me to do more than win a trial. They need to know someone's still fighting for them. Mark sat down across from her. "You're not seriously thinking about walking away from all of this, are you?" Ava met his gaze, a slow smile forming. "No, Mark, I'm thinking about running for city council." Mark's eyebrows shot up. "Seriously?" Ava nodded. "If I've learned anything from this, it's that real change happens when you're at the table, not just standing outside it." She gestured to the notes scattered in front of her. "The city needs someone who's willing to hold people accountable and make sure this kind of corruption doesn't happen again." Mark sat back, a slow grin spreading across his face. "Ava Sinclair, councilwoman. It has a nice ring to it." That afternoon, Ava walked through the neighborhood for the first time since the trial. The air was crisp, and the sky was a brilliant shade of blue. Highland Grove looked like it had been reborn, children playing in front yards, families sitting on porches without fear. She stopped in front of the Johnson's house. Mr. Johnson, the elderly veteran who had refused to sell his home, sat on his porch with his wife, a peaceful smile on his face. He waved Ava over. "Ava," he called. Ava walked up the steps and smiled. "Mr. Johnson, Mrs. Johnson, it's good to see you." Mr. Johnson chuckled. "Thanks to you, we're still here." His expression grew serious. "You know, for a while I thought this place would never feel safe again." Ava nodded. "Me too, but we proved them wrong." Mrs. Johnson patted Ava's hand. "We heard you're thinking about running for city council." Ava laughed softly. "Word travels fast." Mr. Johnson leaned forward. "If you're running, you've got our vote. You've already done more for this neighborhood than anyone sitting in those chairs at City Hall." Ava felt a warmth spread through her chest, the kind of pride that didn't come from medals or accolades, but from knowing she'd made a difference. A week later, Ava stood on the steps of City Hall, facing a crowd of reporters and community members. Mark stood to the side, his phone recording every second, while Carter stood behind him, looking more at ease than Ava had ever seen him. Rachel Cole, notebook in hand, gave Ava a nod from the front row. Ava took a breath, the hum of anticipation vibrating through the air. "Good afternoon," Ava began, her voice steady and clear. The crowd quieted instantly. "Over the past few months, this city has witnessed a painful but necessary reckoning. We've seen the damage that corruption and abuse of power can cause, and we've seen what happens when people rise up and demand justice." She paused, letting her words settle. "But justice isn't a one-time event. It's something we have to fight for every day. That's why I'm here to make sure that the fight doesn't end with one conviction." She took a step forward, her eyes scanning the crowd. "Today I'm officially announcing my candidacy for city council." A ripple of excitement passed through the crowd as reporters raised their microphones. Ava held up her hand to signal for silence. "I'm running because I believe in accountability. I believe in protecting our communities not from each other, but from those who would exploit them for personal gain. And I believe that everyone, no matter where they come from or what they look like, deserves a place where they can live without fear." The applause started slowly, then built into a thunderous roar. Ava's heart swelled as she looked out at the crowd, neighbors, veterans, community leaders, people who had felt powerless until now. That evening, Ava returned home to find a small box sitting on her porch. She hesitated for a moment, memory of Kent's threats still fresh in her mind, but then picked it up and opened it carefully. Inside was a simple silver plaque with an inscription, "For courage in the face of injustice." Ava traced the words with her fingers, a soft smile forming. A handwritten note was tucked beneath the plaque. "For all of us who never thought we'd be heard, thank you. The fight continues, but now we have hope." Ava blinked back tears as she stood in the fading light of the evening. She'd started this journey for herself, to protect her home. But somewhere along the way, it had become about something much bigger. Mark stepped onto the porch, holding 2 glasses of lemonade. He handed one to Ava and nodded toward the horizon. "The city's different now, and it's because of you." Ava took a sip, the tangy sweetness warming her throat. She let the silence settle around them, peaceful for the first time in what felt like forever. "No," she said after a moment. "It's because of all of us." Mark raised his glass. "To new beginnings." Ava smiled and clinked her glass against his. "To justice." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ava felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but as the lights of Highland Grove flickered on, one by one, Ava was ready to build something stronger, something lasting. And this time, she wouldn't be fighting alone. As Ava Sinclair stood at the threshold of her new journey, she knew that justice wasn't just about one person. It was about the power of many voices coming together to demand change. Her story reminds us that resilience, courage, and community can overcome even the darkest challenges. If Ava's journey inspired you, remember that we all have the power to make a difference, no matter the obstacles. Thank you for joining us on this incredible story of bravery, hope, and justice. If you enjoyed this content and want more powerful stories that highlight the fight for what's right, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us share meaningful stories that matter. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss what's next. See you in the next chapter of our journey.